This is The Baseline, discussing the hot button topics of the NBA. Welcome, everybody. You're tuned to The Baseline. Callie Warrenshaw discussing the hot button topics of the NBA. Back and at it again, doing our coveted Autopsy Reports. Your boy, Callie, a.k.a. Dr. Kill Patience, and my man, the most knowledgeable one, the Dr. Zhivago of basketball, our man, Mr. Warrenshaw, repping out of Fort Lauderdale, Florida, joining me as always, brother. What is good? What's happening? We are now fully embedded in spring, so it's time for us to spring into action as we continue to body up some of these teams in our coveted Autopsy Reports.
Zip them all the way up here and just doing a little spring cleaning, on our end, getting these bodies up out of here and getting them out of here pretty early for us. I'm excited to talk about these two teams because they have something that they should be excited about in terms of like future stars or potential stars already in the making, if you will. And I'm interested to see what fans and listeners have to say about that. But they did not have good seasons this year, so here they are on the slab, ready to get zipped all the way up.
Well, listen, your level of optimism is quite refreshing. At least I can say that.
What did our guy Tyler? He called me benevolent the other day, and I was like, "Wow, look at the FCAT word there." But I'm trying to be optimistic. I was a little bit of a downer last week, so I'm trying to bring some more optimism this week.
I know I can definitely hear it in your voice. It seems like now that you're around the dead a little bit more, you seem to be a little bit more lively. Oh, by the way, are you excited for Beetlejuice 2024 AD?
Yeah, they could have just kept that in their back pocket, but whatever. And like I said, maybe I'm going to lose my enthusiasm here too. I wasn't a big Beetlejuice guy to begin with, so that's why I'm not excited to see a second one.
Well, maybe they say our podcast name 3 times, man. Who knows?
It's like some Candyman.
Yeah. Isn't that how it always starts, though? It always winds up being you got to say something like 3 times for you to start raising holy hell. So. That's what it basically takes for us to raise holy hell in the podcast game. Anyway, we appreciate you and yours for hopping on board with us this week. Be sure to get at my man at Shaw Sports NBA or get at me at Game Face Leader Show's Twitter handle NBA Baseline. Available on all the major platforms. You know where to find us. Go to www.thebaselineNBA.com to check out this episode and all of our previous episodes. And if you see us on the YouTube channel, definitely hit us up. Give us a subscribe. Hopefully you'll like what we're giving you. And if you see the blue and white logo, that means we rock with the 19 Media Group family. 19 Media Group, we run in these content streets. So be sure to go to www.19mediagroup.com to check out not only our show, but also the family of great show and content creators that are a part of the 19 Media Group family. So let's get right into it, Shaw, our coveted Autopsy Reports. We're going to be talking about 2 teams in this week's show. And first team that we're going to put up on the slab is going to be the Charlotte Hornets. Listen, there's no surprise with this team. Definitely struggle out the gate, and it's hard to say that a team you can assess properly when their star player is virtually on the slab. Let's say on the mend. The team is on the slab, but he is on the mend. But I think the first thing that we have to really address, right? Like the thing that we have to call out, the elephant in the room about this, Shaw, is this is again another year in which they do not have their star fully healthy through the stretch of a regular season. And while all eyes are on the talent of LaMelo Ball and what his potential could be and what everyone has been hoping for, let's not act like this is something that has to be taken into consideration if you're Mitch Kupchak, if you're Steve Clifford, if they choose to keep him around. Like, what are we speaking of now when we say the future of the Charlotte Hornets, when we say has to rest upon the health of LaMelo Ball?
I mean, it absolutely does. I think that you can't talk about this Hornets team without talking about LaMelo and the fact that he's only played 58 games in the last 2 years. They, for whatever reason, not that I saw, have not officially ruled him out for the rest of this season, whatever 14 games left or whatever it is, but he hasn't played since January or whatever it is. He's done. He's not coming back, and there's no reason for that to happen. And I think now you have to really think about what is the evaluation of their medical staff and his body. What continues to happen. He doesn't want to be hurt. He's not trying to be hurt, but that's the reality of their situation. Now, to me, as optimistic as I was saying, kind of coming to the outset, If he's not around, then there's not a whole lot here, unfortunately. Like that's just the reality of this here too. While good player, bad human, in terms of Miles Bridges, sure. Can he score? Can he rebound a little bit and do some things for you? Absolutely. And if that's who they're hitching their wagon to, then that's their business. So from a talent standpoint, he gives them a little bit of something there, but it goes nowhere without LaMelo being there, like absolutely nowhere. And this is a lot of rebound team. And while they're taking a couple swings at some, youthful talent and Trey Mann and, Pokashevsky from OKC, none of these guys are slotted as like, oh my God, I can't wait to have them in here. And, they're going to elevate this team to being at least in play-in contention next year. So it starts and ends with LaMelo and whatever they decide to do with Bridges and the draft picks this upcoming summer.
I want to pick your brain on this because of what you just said with regards to Miles Bridges. Do you think that the Charlotte Hornets elected to keep Miles Bridges around more because of what they potentially saw with him and LaMelo Ball? Or do you think that this is more about LaMelo Ball's influence about wanting to keep Miles Bridges? Because I find it interesting. Like, look, I don't, the fact that he scores a little almost 22 points a game is not anything to sniff at. But part of my thought process is when you brought Brandon Miller onto this team, this essentially was you hitting the reset button and the potential about what this could look like if you had a combination of LaMelo Ball and Brandon Miller. Now, granted, Brandon Miller's had his struggles. He's had his ups and downs so far this year, but you can clearly tell, look, I don't think it's a far leap from a guy who's almost averaging 17 points per game to get you somewhere between 21, 22. I think the question is if Miles Bridges was that much of a problem, so to speak, someone whose focus seemed clearly more off the court than the focus should be about what he could give you on the court. And it's going to be a while before we even see that usurp that aspect of his life or aspect of his game, so to speak. Then my question is what's influencing why the Charlotte Hornets didn't fully hit the reset button when the opportunity presented itself with Miles Bridges?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question in terms of they didn't know going into this year exactly what Brandon Miller was going to be. And maybe they had some conversations with Mr. Bridges as well, too, to kind of like, all right, well, because he has a qualifying offer, right? So he doesn't have a new extension. So he's basically playing this year out to say, hey, well, let me show you what I can do. And now we'll probably get some semblance of a lucrative offer potentially to stay. They could have tried to move him at the deadline. None of that kind of came into play. They elected to keep him for the presumable reasons that they want him to be here long term, and LaMelo probably wants him to be there long term. So you're right. I think Brandon Miller, LaMelo, and Bridges are an interesting three. An offensive-minded, front three.
They're an interesting three. Yeah, it's kind of like when you're doing forensics, like, oh, well, this is something interesting. That I didn't see this bullet hole in the.
There's something there, but primarily offensively. Yeah. And I think that another aspect of that too, is you mentioned Clifford before, and Clifford has not traditionally been an offensive-minded coach. So like their skill sets don't necessarily play to what his coaching skill set is, and I think they're going to have to figure out a way to marry that, or do a lot of teams do get the proverbial assistants on the sidelines that have those specialties, and you have, an offensive coordinator, defensive coordinator, and that type of stuff as well too. So to me, Brandon Miller, Bridges, and LaMelo are solid. And then whatever they end up doing in the draft, everything else on this roster, I think they're more or less taking flyers on. Got Grant Williams from Dallas and traded PJ Washington. I already talked about Trey Mann and Pokashevsky. Their bigs have not had the years that they think they wanted to had, and Nick Richards and Mark Williams. Both of those guys have battled injuries and been in and out of the lineup. I don't think we've seen Williams since, I don't know, like maybe November, December. I can't remember if this guy even played this year, after coming on the scene and having a pretty good start in the first 15 or 20 games or so. And then outside of that, like I said, it's just tough. Davis Bertans, non-guaranteed. Like, what are you really going to do with that contract long term? So this is a situation where they've got to figure out what they want to be on both sides of the basketball, because even though we've kind of lauded Clifford's potential defensive chops here, that hasn't translated to them being a good defensive team. And they're not even in the top 15, if you will. So just league average in almost any significant statistical category. They're in the bottom half of that, and mostly in the bottom third of the league in almost anything that matters when it comes to statistics. So a lot of growth here, but it starts with LaMelo Ball being actually on the damn floor.
Listen, it's weird because you look at this team's roster, and this is a relatively young team, Shaw. You can make the comparisons that, this team can be maybe top 5 top 6 as far as, the average age of this team, being among one of the younger teams. Cody Martin, I think, is like 28 on this team,
Yeah.
or something like that. So this team has a very has an extended learning curve. Let's use that terminology for them, which again then brings this question to Steve Clifford to the forefront. Is Steve Clifford the right person that you want for this kind of usefulness to extract the level of talent expectations that I think Kupchak has put together with this roster, right? And I understand that like a lot of this dynamic has been impacted since Michael Jordan has exited stage left. But I think now we can finally say this is really on Kupchak, and this is really on Kupchak's decision making about what the organization from top to bottom wants to do in giving people the interpretation about what this team wants to be in the next 3 to 5 years. And I mean, these are the core years based on if your belief is in LaMelo Ball, if your belief is in Kupchak's ability to scout the right talent and put the pieces together that they collectively become whole, right?
Well,
You know,
I mean, but the other aspect of it too is that Kupchak is also stepping down, right? So that announcement came, and it kind of was like almost like a news dump because I feel like it happened around All Star or shortly thereafter. So he's not intending to be here. He might be I think he might be taking some sort of advisory role, so to speak, but he's not looking to be the
that
general
still means
manager, president.
I understand, but you know what that also says to me, Shaw? That basically says to me that if he's taking an advisory role, his advice is still going to be resonant in even whoever else comes on board, right? I'm more curious about whether or not there is transparency to the idea that Kupchak no longer wants those responsibilities. Therefore, he's going to put somebody else, or the organization is going to put somebody else in place. Is that person going to be independent of and really kind of carve out what he believes should be the real culture of how Charlotte Hornet basketball needs to be played? Or is he just going to be another puppet string to the idea that Kupchak just doesn't want to deal with the business anymore? He doesn't want to get his hands dirty in this anymore. He doesn't want to get thrown, the mud getting thrown for what he hasn't been able to achieve in doing. And I think that to me is going to speak loudly when we see what takes place in this offseason, because no matter what you do, Shaw, even if you bring somebody new in to assume the role of what Kupchak is doing, if he's going to have an imprint on this, it means he's going to have to clean house on the roster that Kupchak has put together. So are we already ready to give up on that when you've already basically given up the house, so to speak, to put yourself in this position to get LaMelo Ball, to have gotten Miles Bridges, to have gotten Brandon Miller, and then when the opportunity presents itself, you threw money at Graham, you threw money at Rozier, you threw money at Hayward, and now you're only now starting to clean house. It's just kind of interesting how these things are intersecting with themselves.
Well, I mean, I think your point though is, will he be there? The answer to that is no. Again, advisor role. And then I think that does bring up the larger question for Clifford as well too. And I think at this stage, this has been a failed return and failed experiment. And I don't think Steve there was a lack of effort in any capacity on that. But I think we both questioned that coming in. Like, why? This is a guy you fired, whatever it was, 2 years previous to that. Then you bring him back. It just none of it made sense, and it just hasn't worked. Yes, the injuries are a huge part of that, unfortunately, but now you've got to turn that proverbial page and ultimately come with a decision. And the one good thing I can say about this season as well, too, is that, well, in some ways, they've picked a youthful direction. In some ways, right? Bridges, I don't know how old is Bridges. He 25, 26? So still within the proverbial timeline. But if they got off Rozier, they got off of Hayward, those are two big deals that didn't really make sense for even their timeline and even their talent level. Now you're starting to try to reset and see what happens. But you're 1,000% correct. The general management and the coaching position of the seat is probably going to be whenever the season ends. That it will be like that Black Monday in the NFL. That Clifford will probably be out of there, or he'll gracefully resign. You know what I mean? Maybe they won't fire him since they brought him back in the way it is.
I'd like for him to.
Save some face.
I would like for him to mutually agree that if the direction of this team does not comport with the way that he wants to coach this basketball team, that he should step aside. And I think this is a great opportunity. And I know we got a couple other things we want to get into with regards to the Hornets, but I think this is a great opportunity to highlight, Shaw, we're starting to see something different now. I believe that we're kind of starting to turn the corner where we're bringing in fresher voices who and are extending themselves a little bit more, showing a little bit level of patience, and I think it's starting to bear fruit. Right? Look at Willie Green. Look at Dagenal. Look at Darko out in Toronto. Right? I
Bull
feel
Hardy, Utah. Yeah, a lot of great guys.
there's a lot of great guys, and I think especially in this era right now that we're dealing with the offensive movement of basketball, I think we're seeing that they're starting to kind of squeeze a couple of guys in there that I really think are going to be helpful. Let's keep it 100. While there's still conversations about trying to be a defensive minded type thing, the NBA doesn't want to go backwards to a point where the game becomes so sluggish. So I think that there's going to be something of a happy medium and balance. What I want to see more of is those guys who are showing their innovation to what you have, especially if you've got younger players that have the capabilities to execute in that kind of way. And the Hornets are in a position to do that. Now, whether or not they pull the trigger on doing it, to your point, Shaw, and to what we were saying, really comes down to the executive part of the organization recognizing that they are going to have to get younger, even with the mentality of the culture that they're trying to build around for the Hornets.
Yeah. So, I mean, when we always have to talk about the finances, right? So $116 million in committed salary next year. You know, they have team options on guys like Mark Williams, Trey Mann, you know, even JT Thor. Again, shown some things as well. Probably pick those things up and, you know, carry the season out for just because you want to have the proverbial bodies. But then what is the extension that you give Bridges? At what number do you bring him back that you're comfortable? Understanding that LaMelo's max contract kicks in next year, well, he'll be making $35 million. It's one thing to be on the rookie scale, right? And, you know, playing 25 to 35 games a season. Now, when you're getting paid $35 million and at the end of this contract, $46 to $48 million, you know, that's got to, you got to be there. You got to be on the damn basketball court. So they have some big financial decisions to make here, especially in the case of Bridges. But then even some of those supplemental pieces, as I mentioned in Williams and Trey Mann, you know, what are the options that you'd want to pick up? Or, you know, do you try to thin this out some more and see what you can do? And we know they haven't traditionally been a free agent destination unless they're going to throw money at somebody, aka like how they did for Gordon Hayward. And this isn't a great free agent class. So to me, I think you did everything that you just said, right? Kupchak is out. Clifford gracefully bows out. Maybe you get a young, you know, a hot shot coach to kind of come in here and try to boost up the offense, if you will, get them kind of learning and trying to play the right way. And then you fill the roster out for this year, this next year, which will be another growing year, but really see what you have in Brandon Miller now too. And is he the number 2? Is he the number 3? Can he coexist with Bridges? You know what I mean? And kind of number 2 roles, assuming LaMelo is healthy. And I think it's a growth year for the Hornets going into next season.
Absolutely. You're tuned to the Baseline. Callie Warren Shaw discussing the hot button topics of the NBA. A couple of points, I guess, you know, before we properly eulogize this team, Shaw. Like, so when you look at this roster, right? If we were going to believe that this roster from a young, youthful side of things has the potential to have a breakout, who should we be paying attention to? Who are you saying, yo, man, I don't want to throw any more dirt on your name and on your game. So in this offseason, I need you to be on one. I need you to come back looking like a completely different person who's going to have an initial impact for this team, for this roster, for us to buy in, you know, whether or not this Hornets team is going to take strides, especially if they're anticipating a fully healthy LaMelo Ball. And they're obviously, you know, going to have an improved Brandon Miller, and, you know, you're going to get what you get from Miles Bridges. But who out of those other 3 are we saying, you know what, homie, I need you to take that next step?
Well, it's interesting because, again, the easiest answer in terms of who they need is Brandon Miller, right? Like, you need that gradual progression coming in, seeing into second year, third year, et cetera, et cetera. But I think it's honestly the position that they've had a lot of problem with, and that's at that 5 man. And we just talked about, you know, Mark Williams, Nick Richards. Which one of those 2 guys is the guy? You know, who's going to be willing to kind of step in there and say, listen, I'm a double threat every single night. No, you don't have to be 20-10, but can you be 12-10? You know what I mean? Just consistently be there, not necessarily even as a post presence, but as a lob threat, or whatever the case to be, putbacks, energy big, whatever it is. I think both of those 2 guys have been They just haven't been healthy enough to kind of really give the Hornets what they've needed to man that middle. And they've always been talking about this since the Plumlee days or whatever the case to be. They just haven't had consistency at that 5 spot. So, with Mark Williams being the younger of the two, and he had earned the starting position. And I speaking about it from a fantasy standpoint, ironically, like he was a guy who was like, yo, watch him. There's nobody else really there. And then he just got hurt and hasn't been there. To me, those are the two guys. Even if they end up splitting minutes down the middle, 24 minutes a night, or the case be, what are they getting at? Can they get 8 and 8? Out of those guys on a regular basis. And I think that'd be an amazing progression for both of them and be a great benefit to LaMelo specifically, if he's hoisting shots or having a dump off thread, if he's driving, to get into the dunker spot. Those are things that those two guys can potentially do. And they just got to put in the work this offseason.
Who do you think has the most confidence to really, I guess, kind of elevate the team between the three? Between Ball, between Bridges, between Miller? I'm leaning a little bit more on Miller because I really feel like he has a more sound, mechanically polished game where he can, reestablish the fact that the Hornets can hit a jump shot. He can, really, open up the floor a little bit better. And it could mean in some respects that Miles Bridges might have to take a back seat, if LaMelo Ball is out there. But I also say LaMelo Ball and his ability to pick to pick up the pace, to get them out open more in transition, that definitely plays more to Miles Bridges. So I'm just curious, who you think really will thrive more when that opportunity presents itself and then we see all three of these guys on the court together?
Well, it's an interesting question because I think the playmaking responsibilities fall with LaMelo. And so the elevation, if you will, of all players, all things, the tide that lifts all ships or whatever the case to be, has to be LaMelo in that capacity. So he's the one who can take less shots, can rebound the basketball and push it on the break and throw a lob to Bridges if so be, or secondary break, have Brandon Miller fill in, on the corner and maybe pop a 3. To me, him and his health are the key to what the Hornets do regardless. But it's also so much of the aspect of what he means to everybody else, not just what he brings statistically by himself. There's no other guy on this team that can elevate everybody's skill level and get them open shots in the way that LaMelo can. And truly, he has a special skill set. There's not a lot of players in the league that can do that. But for this team specifically, listen, Trey Mann and I can't say the European's name, Micic or whatever. Those aren't the guys. And I think Trey Mann's a good basketball player. Love him in a backup role potentially, behind LaMelo. But it has to be LaMelo who's out here bringing the energy and allowing everybody to be better than what they would be without him on the basketball court.
All right, the Charlotte Hornets probably are going to wind up maybe 20 wins this year, Shaw. I'm picking the under on that. Right now they're sitting with 17 with a handful of games left to go, like 14. I think you said earlier 14, 15 games left to go.
They got 12. They have 12 games left.
Oh yeah. So I'm not feeling confident that they're going to wind up, getting to 20. But if they do, I would think that at least, give Coach Steve Clifford a good send off. It's like, just don't be hovering around like, among one of the worst teams in the NBA, in NBA history. You know what I mean? So. All right, Callie Warnshaw, Baseline NBA podcast. Coming up, we're going to be talking about the San Antonio Spurs. I know. Everybody, and I promise you, most of this conversation will not only be about Victor Wembanyama, but can you blame us if that's what the team is resting its shoulders of promise on? Yeah, who wouldn't, right? With the phenom. But first, did you know that there's a whole collection of Black-led products that fit into your daily routine and lifestyle that you can get at Walmart? And it's so important that we show Black founders some love, not just during Black History Month, but all year long. Because every time we buy a Black-led brand, we're making room or creating demand for another Black-led brand. Black founders and the products they bring to the table are creating a whole new world of choices at Walmart. Some of the products I want to check out are our Natural Vert Granola, Zach and Zoe Honey, Scotch Porter Beard Balm, and Partake Cookies. Go to walmart.com/blackandunlimited to discover all the amazing Black-owned products that you can add to your daily routine. We're talking San Antonio Spurs. You don't want to miss out here on the Baseline. Cal Lee, Warren Shaw, Baseline NBA podcast, as we do our coveted autopsy report. Time now for us, Shaw, to talk about the San Antonio Spurs. And I don't know, given the way everyone is in a fervor about Victor Wembanyama and, the next generational levels to the way he plays this game of basketball, we may not be talking about the San Antonio Spurs come next year the way that we do, burying them the way that we do, eulogizing them the way that we do because of the Wemby.
Well, you're optimistic there. I think
did I play it up really well? Because
you played it up really well. That was expert.
I was trying to sell myself so much on the idea that everyone believes that he is going to suddenly turn this team into like a 45-win team.
Yeah. I mean, not so fast. I think we'll continue to see his growth potential to be defensive player of the year next year. They won't have enough wins for him to be in the MVP race, but he'll be putting up MVP type numbers, assuming he gets off these minutes restrictions and things like that. Like he's the real deal. And I think you can't gush enough about how amazing he's been this season. And been just delivered on everything that they've hoped for. And again, in limited minutes specifically, it's the others that makes you very concerned about next year's prospect. They are not quite sure what they're doing with Keldon Johnson, and I don't think he's had the bounce back that they would have hoped he would have had in various roles, whether he's coming off the bench or starting. While Devin Vassell is somebody who they seem to be attached to in some ways, I don't know that he's it. Obviously, they love Sohan, and he's been a nice, I think, middle piece for that they're continuing to develop, but he still has limitations, especially offensively. The Spurs don't really know who they are just yet. They just know they have this amazing foundational piece, and now they got to figure out how they fill in around it. And that doesn't seem like a likely thing that they'll be able to do just over the course of this summer. And that makes me very concerned, in addition to the fact that, as I could continue to allude to, it's not an amazing free agent class. Biggest names that could potentially come to them. Tobias Harris, who we talked about, last week, maybe if he would return to Detroit or something like that too. Maybe DeMar DeRozan, who's obviously had a tour of duty with Greg Popovich in San Antonio, but it's getting them closer to being competitive, which is what Wemby needs, but it doesn't put them in the throes of the playing conversation, I think, next year either. And I think that's what it is. Like, they need to decide now, how fast do we want to get there? How fast is realistic for us to get there? With Wemby in tow. Like, as I said before, I use the analogy, hey, he's a Ferrari and he's ready to ride, but you may not have the requisite ability to drive as fast as you want to, because the other pieces just aren't there. And I think that's where they are ultimately going to have to decide and figure out. They'll get a top 3, top 5 pick this year, unless they move it, I guess, potentially for maybe some star who we don't know might become available. But to me, this is still at least 2 years out before the Spurs are back to relevance. But I don't know if Wemby's willing to wait that long.
So you sound, and I'm not, trying to diss or critique you or anything like that, Shaw, but you sound like someone who is of the mindset that, like, because Wemby is like a Ferrari and it's ready to go, that the San Antonio Spurs seem to already be like stuck in the garage, right? Like they're still stuck in the pit and have no preparation, have no plan in place, for ready to ride out. And I guess part of me is a little concerned with that thought process, because I'm like, if anyone is trying to reconnect what the Spurs did to create that dynasty that they had, the missing part of this was that the team was already foundationally sound when they had David Robinson, when they finally had Tim Duncan, then everything started to come into place, right? And because we're in a different era with the way that free agency operates, I don't know if I'm of the mindset that if you're the San Antonio Spurs, you're playing this game through the level of free agency as much as you should be buying into getting it right with the picks that you're drafting the players, the rosters with, right? Like, so to your point, you're saying that you don't see where Sohan, where Johnson, and the parts that are right now around Wembanyama, they don't fit, correct? So
not that they don't fit, they're not the accelerant that I think a person of his talent is. Like, so they can work, but if you could move Vassell and Johnson to get, another star or somebody, that's in the same atmosphere. These are right now complementary guys. And if you give Vasil enough shots, he's going to score 20 a game. If you give Kel Johnson enough shots, same thing. But that doesn't mean they are the overall right parts for the accelerant. They're fine complementary players, but how do they get enough? Those two guys are their path to a potential another star. And what you're saying, I think, as well too, is like, well, they could draft that, but that's where it goes back to my earlier point. Well, then you're probably 2 or 3 years away from really being able to see the fruits of that, even if you get a top 5 pick this year.
Right. And so I think that to me is what I'm alluding to more so. Are you leaning into the idea as like, you don't think that the Spurs can afford to wait that long, or you don't think that based on the way that Wembanyama is, that he has the patience to cultivate and elevate those guys that would be coming on board, that would be the fit for how he plays? It's interesting to me because when I think about guys like Sohan and Keldon Johnson, to your point, yeah, they can go out, they could probably score, and they could be complementary pieces as if it's baked into this idea that they won't be able to make Wembanyama a better player. And based on the way that Wembanyama plays, it doesn't look like he'll make them better players. So, where would we see a veteran? Like, what kind of player are we talking about that could make Wembanyama a better player than he's already ascending himself to, where it's translating to the level of success that I think, San Antonio Spurs fans are trying to say it's going to be within the next couple of years?
Right. I mean, I do think they'll need some semblance of, truly dynamic wing play or guard play. And I don't think they have that in any player right now currently. And that's why I'm saying Vasil and Johnson can be pieces that get you maybe whatever guy. The draft pick that they'll have this upcoming summer could maybe get them another piece that gets them that other guy. Wemby, to me, and I don't know him, personally. When you have somebody, I think, of that talent level, you're thinking maybe the first 2 years can be growth. All right, learn the game, play your minutes, understand whatever. But by year 3, you're expecting to kind of really see some fruits of that labor. So I think they can toil around, so to speak, for maybe another year in this, but they've got to start putting the plan into place here now. Again, they knew what Wemby was, or hoped they knew what he was going into it. I think he's probably even exceeded some of those expectations, which makes it a little bit more pressure packed now to be like, hey, no, we gotta get moving. So you have, again, another year where you can kind of buy this being this, 18, 22 win team, whatever it is. But year 3, that guy's going to want to go. And I think that's what I'm getting at. And do you have the requisite pieces that can get you there? And what I say now is, again, not a strong free agent draft class. So can you conjure up the assets within your internal roster? Currently, they still have a bunch of picks, again, from the DeJounte Murray trade, moving him over to Atlanta a couple of years ago as well, too. Couple first round picks they got from Boston in the Derek White deal as well. So they can move some stuff around and be creative, to pry away another, potential all-star type level of talent with them. But there's not another all-star on this roster currently constructed, like not even close.
Yeah. And I agree with you. There's not any potential all-star caliber. I just wonder if whether or not you see that there's potential for them to become one. Right. And so it doesn't sound like, from the way that you're evaluating and what you've seen from how they play and their style of play, that any of that's going to happen. Here's the thing that really becomes unfortunate, Shaw. And I don't know if whether or not people recognize this or speaking to this. If you really look at this is bad timing for the San Antonio Spurs. There was a window of opportunity where they could be able to just kind of be marginally bad. And because the Southwest Division was marginally good, the gap between what a bad San Antonio Spurs team would look like in the rest of, that division would be maybe like 3 or 4 games. Now you look at the way that this division is reflective of, you got Ime Udoka and the turnaround of what he's done with the Houston Rockets, which is absolutely phenomenal. The New Orleans Pelicans have a new gear. Don't know whether or not it's viable. We'll see how this translates, but it's definitely trending in the direction where they're, it's going to be a reoccurring theme that they're going to be a part of the playoff picture. The Dallas Mavericks, right, with this combination of Luka and Kyrie Irving and the talent that they're making those guys essentially better very quickly. And, to me, the Memphis Grizzlies, when they eventually get back Ja Morant, like, I know that they may be the slowest of the two because of the pieces they couldn't keep, but you're always going to feel like with Ja Morant, and Desmond Bane, that this team is going to be competitive. So this division is stacked from top to bottom. So I get to your point where there's that level of impatience. If you're Wembanyama, like, yo, we got to be able to ride with these thoroughbreds that are already in our division. I'm just curious though, Shaw, like, if next year is not going to be a good free agency class, then
this year is not a good
this year. But this is not going to be a good free agency class. Then I would think that the emphasis has to be focused on the current parts and this offseason for them to significantly take a step forward. Because even if worst case scenario, Shaw, you don't see them being, at least they will elevate themselves to where they can be tradable pieces. Like you look at these guys right now, they're not even tradable pieces. I don't know what you could possibly get, even for, you know what I'm saying, bad players that are out there, so to speak. I'm not saying they're bad, but I'm just saying what they bring to the table doesn't invite anyone to be saying, yeah, bring me him. I want this dude. I want that dude from your roster. There's not a whole lot of pickings from that, but they've got to be able to play significantly better so that their trade value is even worth the conversation.
Well, I mean, but remember, that's a double-edged sword. It can go both ways, right? So, and beauty is always in the eye of the beholder. Who looks at Keldon Johnson potentially and says, "Hey, I can do something with that"? Or some people say, "No, he's topped out. This is who he ultimately is." Do you give him another year? Does he play worse? You know what I mean? So, I mean, it's just a cost-benefit analysis. One of the things the Spurs have in that, and again, as you were talking, is like, well, let me just make sure I have my facts right. No, they have 3 first-round picks this year, and they have 3 first-round picks next year. So, there's some protections on it, I think with Toronto, I think this year, I think there's protection with Charlotte next year as well, too. But they can be trading picks within the lottery and their own if they were so inclined, if another superstar, if you will, or at least even all-star were to become available in either of the next 2 years. But sometimes, as we all know, it's like, all right, well, the picks don't create the equity that's needed to bring superstar or all-star level talent in. So you need the salaries in essence to match. And that's where Johnson and Vasil kind of come into play. Vasil just, got his extension. He's going to be making $20 million or something like that over the next couple of seasons. So that's where I'm like, well, yeah, you can keep those guys, but if you're really trying to add that accelerant, that's your path to do it. But they do have some leeway between this year and next year, having 6 first rounders, 3 in each in the next 3 each in the next 2 years.
Where do you think Greg Popovich leans on the most to see the rapid improvement of this basketball team, right? Like, Greg Popovich started as a defensive minded guru. He has, transitioned where he's put together offensively talented rosters. And, we've seen him basically play patchwork orange with marginal rosters to be competitive and compete in the playoffs. Where do you lean on with us trying to kind of be in the mind of Greg Popovich going into this offseason to say, look, we're not so good on this. And even when we bring in what we bring in from our draft class, I'm thinking this might be the best pathway forward for us to start, getting some of those L's that we could not get. And listen, by all stretch of the by all accounts, Shaw, it wasn't like the San Antonio Spurs were just this horrible basketball team. They have been a very competitive basketball team. This is a basketball team that can compete. Whether or not the level of confidence that they can compete and do this through the course of a regular season, I think to your point is what speaks to the fact that maybe some of the talent has topped itself out, and you can only get away with doing this when you're playing against bad competition. But when you're playing against the best of the best, you're not really seeing these guys elevating themselves to the level that you see Victor Wembanyama elevating himself to. So if you're Greg Popovich, what do you lean on as far as being a competitive basketball team more? Is it more on the defensive side of the basketball? Is it going to be more on the offensive side of the basketball?
And I think you even know the answer to that. I think, Popovich has traditionally been probably a better defensive coach than offensive coach. Not that he's been a bad offensive coach in any aspect or capacity, but ultimately defense often it revolves around scheme and effort. And those are things you can intimately control on a regular basis. The offense, it's that's more skill-based. And that you can't always just teach. That takes a lot of time, in essence, to develop or acquire the requisite talent, in essence, to kind of get you there. Right now, they're 30th in three-point shooting. They're one of the worst teams, in offense in general. They're not great in defense either, 22nd. But those are things I think, especially with Wemby as a lighthouse, if you will, and the overall deterrent in the middle, that can be the centerpiece of what you do defensively. And so, sure, if you can buy what the NBA is saying, is like, hey, we're going to look to see how we can, empower defenses more going into next season. We're seeing scoring come down here since the All-Star break here a little bit. That's where San Antonio can make the most amount of, hey, they can't ignore offense, but that's where they can hang the proverbial hat on and say, like, all right, well, we're going to be a defensive-minded team first, knowing that we may only score 100 or 105, and see what we can do there to get some requisite shooting and see if we can get timely offense, as I like to talk about, especially when games get close in those clutch minutes late in the fourth quarter.
All right, Shaw, let's properly eulogize the San Antonio Spurs. I want you to give me an ideal situation of who you would love to see Victor Wembanyama paired up with in the next couple of years. That gives you the confidence that, this would be a San Antonio Spurs team that would be considered as one of the more dangerous, teams to probably be considered, in maybe its franchise history. If we're talking about Wembanyama in the way that we're speaking about him, who would you would love to see be paired up with to kind of elevate, to emulate that level of danger?
Well, I mean, you can have the wish list, right? And then I think that's the aspect of what's potentially realistic. And I'm going to go on that lens, and, maybe you can bring more, color to it in terms of like, hey, here's what you'd want to see. But I think if I canvass the league and think, okay, realistically, is there another star or all-star level guy who the Spurs could potentially get? And that guy actually is Trae Young. I think, they could visit the Atlanta situation, especially with Trae Young potentially may or may not be coming back this year, and whatever happens with their playoff run. Can you say, hey, let's bring you over here and see if we can build something here? Especially you have that 1, you have that 5, that could be really good. I don't think Donovan Mitchell is somebody who would go there, and especially when his contract is up. So that would take a lot of workability and some doing. But I could see that being a pairing that could bring them some positivity in the short term and the long term, and giving and taking a lot of pressure off of Wemby as well too, to be the offensive hub and the defensive hub. So I think in that regard, whoever that second star is can't be more defensive minded, and sure can be two-way, if you will, but has to be somebody who's elite, I think, offensively to help the Spurs get to what they ultimately need to go to. So I'll turn the question back around to you. Who would you like to see, I guess, best case scenario, Wemby potentially paired up with?
Man, who would I love to see best case scenario? If I wanted to see the future of the NBA from a backcourt, front court perspective, I would love to see. I would love. It'll never happen, but I would love to see Ja Morant and Victor Wembanyama.
Yeah,
that would be my dream situation, dream scenario. But if I'm saying something more realistic, with what's currently out there in the landscape of the NBA, pay attention to the Lonzo Ball situation. I would be very curious to see what the San Antonio Spurs might be able to do and would want to do. At some point, I think if you are the Chicago Bulls, you really have to start reassessing how much longer you can continue to keep Lonzo Ball on your roster if you're talking about trying to do a move forward. And I think that there can be a point where Lonzo Ball can be a healthy, like adequate, still young, but I find it like I don't see where the longevity of his career stays in Chicago. I see guys like Rudy Gay. I've seen other veteran guys out there maintain their longevity playing like either in San Antonio, Phoenix, or out in the western, places. So if there's that level of seriousness of us considering what kind of combination you would love to see and it be more realistic, I think if you're the Chicago Bulls, you have to start kind of twirling with the idea, like, what can we do? What might need to happen? And if you're the San Antonio Spurs, what kind of skill set player would I love to see without compromising the elevation of Wembanyama, but the both of them paired together can really, really kind of take this team to like another level? I would love to see that type of combination go down.
Well, it's interesting because I think Chicago poses a lot of interest for a couple of different teams. Kobe White's just his emergence, if you will, this season to being one of the most improved players this year. Does that negate the need for Lonzo moving forward? Like, Kobe has really developed, and I really like that young man a lot. So yeah, could they explore something that gets him? They still have the Zach LaVine situation they need to figure out, from an offensive and defensive standpoint too. So Spurs, I don't think they would, because the contract is just so albatrossy, if you will, right. But would make some sense, in terms of getting somebody who can.
Is that one of your LCAT words?
No, but making stuff up here on the fly, right? Okay. But it's, LaVine would bring some offense to a team that very, very much needs it. Ironically, though, I think my worst case scenario for Wemby coming into this before he got drafted was like, I did want to see him with the aforementioned team, the other Ball brother and Charlotte. Had Charlotte been so fortunate, and while Brandon Miller is great and all, listen, the combination in theory of LaMelo and Wemby would have been something that would have been striking the fear of whatever into a lot of people for a very long time.
Well, nobody wants that crystal ball in the Eastern Conference at all.
But ultimately it didn't happen, and Wemby goes to the organization that is probably better equipped to develop him for the majority share of his NBA career, which I think is obviously amazing for him. But yeah, I think, there will be no shortage of guys lining up to potentially play with him if the opportunity arises for the Spurs, especially fiscally.
All right. So final thought, Shaw. How confident are you? Do you think that this next year will be an improved year for the San Antonio Spurs, or do you find them to be kind of like the type of team that, is based on whatever their season ends at, they're going to probably wind up right back into the same fold, roughly numbers wise, as far as wins go, before we start talking about this type of turnaround of team coming, raising themselves out of the dead?
There to me are a great unknown, because in some ways you feel like their general management is astute and that they will at least kick the tires, but they're not going to do anything that doesn't behoove them in the short term. So that, I think they'll do everything they can to investigate opportunities to make some semblance of a rapid improvement, especially with 3 first-round picks this year, and maybe some guys that, could be high-level role players on some other teams in addition to their own. But they won't do anything that's just like, listen, that doesn't make any sense. They're not dumping assets in any capacity. So that depends on what the market bears for them this upcoming season, and what happens in the playoffs and which team gets eliminated. It's just like that you didn't think they should have been gone that far. And then can you make a magical run at some player that we're not even talking about here currently? So there's too many unknowns and variables, but I trust that they will be investigative in all ways possible that improves their roster. So that answer has to kind of stay in my back pocket until I can kind of see how the market shares for them.
All right, man. Well, this has been good stuff. I'm looking forward to see what version of the San Antonio Spurs are going to become in the offseason. I'm not even really concerned about what even a draft pick looks like, as much as I would be very curious to see which guys are putting in that work for the offseason, because I agree with you. I think for us to really, really assess the direction of this team, the mindset of this team, it has to come down to us not completely focusing on what we already have come to understand regarding the greatness of Victor Wembanyama. It has to be about the rest of these other guys for us to be able to better depict on what direction the Spurs want to go, whether it's keeping the assets or moving the assets along. Because I think that will go a long way into your point, Shaw. What kind of rebuild process are we talking about with this organization? Awesome stuff, Shaw. As per always, man. I love when we get to talk about these teams the way that we do, properly bury them the way that we do, autopsy them, get into the forensics state of mind, so to speak, when we get with these teams, man.
Yeah, I think there's a little bit more optimism than the first 2 teams we talked about here, just because they have, at least in theory, talent that is elite in some way or another, that has all-star level capability in both LaMelo and Wemby. Conversely, while we spoke about Washington and Detroit last week, those 2 guys have fringe level guys, if you will. If this person gets hurt, this person gets hurt to make all-stars, but all-stars don't make you a good basketball team or a basketball player in any capacity. I think with LaMelo and Wemby specifically, those guys have talent that can really truly elevate their proverbial franchises on both sides of the basketball court, and hopefully Hopefully they'll both be healthy next year, with some tweaks to, I think, all the rosters that can get them in a better position to be successful in the years to come.
Absolutely, man. Well said. Well said. Well said. You should, get into the business of doing these eulogies and send-offs, man. I'm telling you, the families of these organizations would yeah,
Well,
this could be a business for you. Just basically hey, put it up on LinkedIn, bro.
well, this is definitely a partnership. We do this together, so I think if in your local cities you'd like us to come and properly eulogize your team, we'll be happy to take the baseline on the road here, courtesy of 19 Media Group.
Absolutely. All right. Once again, man, thank you everybody for hopping on board. We'd like to get your thoughts, so be sure to get at us on all the social media outlets. You know where to find us. For the baseline, Callie, Warren Shaw, we appreciate you guys. You know we do. And we'll catch up with you next time.